The box in Nathan Reyes's hands weighed almost nothing. A coffee mug his daughter had painted, a phone charger, a laminated badge he no longer needed, and one thin folder. He walked out the front doors of Meridian Dynamics while the laughter followed him across the lobby. Easy laughter. The kind people let themselves have when they are certain the game is already over and they are on the winning side of it. Grant Mercer stood near the security desk with his arms folded, watching Nathan go with the small satisfied look of a man who had just cleaned something off his shoe. Beside him, Renee Coleman checked her phone. Todd Vance said something under his breath, and two junior analysts snickered on cue. Nathan did not turn around. He pushed through the revolving door, stepped into the cold morning air, and set the box down on the low granite wall by the entrance. Then he took out his phone, scrolled to a contact saved under a single letter, and pressed call. The line connected on the first ring. His voice was quiet, almost flat. There was no shake in it, no heat. He said 3 sentences. The last one was the one people would repeat for years afterward, in break rooms and text threads and quiet dinners with old coworkers who had left the company long ago. Fire every one of them. He hung up, picked up the box, and walked to his car. Behind him, past the glass, the building had already started to come apart from the inside. It just didn't know it yet. To understand how a man could get walked out of a building at 9 in the morning and own that same building by lunch, you have to go back 3 weeks. To the Monday Nathan Reyes showed up for the first time carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a name that meant nothing to anyone on the 4th floor. That was the whole point. He had asked for it that way. Nathan was 43. 7 years earlier, he had built a small freight routing software company out of a rented office above a tire shop, run it hard for most of a decade, and sold it to a larger logistics firm for a number that changed his life and, in a quieter way, ended it. Because 6 months after the sale closed, his wife Elena was diagnosed, and 11 months after that, she was gone. And Nathan found himself alone in a house that was too big with a 5-year-old daughter named Lucy, who still asked, some nights, when Mommy was coming home. So he stopped. He turned down board seats. He let the money sit and grow and mostly ignored it. He learned to braid hair badly and pack lunches well, and for 3 years, the most important thing in his life was getting Lucy to school on time and being there in the pickup line at 3:15. Then Lucy turned 8 and grew a little more independent, and one evening Nathan's old lawyer and closest friend, Ellen Park, sat across from him at his kitchen table and told him about Meridian Dynamics. Meridian was a mid-sized freight and warehousing company 40 years old, family-founded, and slowly dying. The founder had passed. His heirs wanted out. The numbers looked fixable to anyone who understood the business the way Nathan did, and the price was low enough that Ellen thought it was one of those rare things, a good company that had simply been run into the ground by people who had stopped paying attention. Nathan bought it. Quietly, through a holding company Ellen set up, he acquired a controlling stake. The existing board stayed on. Management stayed in place. Nobody at Meridian below the very top knew the company had changed hands, because the deal was structured to close in stages, and Nathan did not want a press release. He wanted something else. He wanted to see it from the inside first. Ellen thought he was being sentimental. Maybe he was. But Nathan had a theory he had believed his entire working life, and losing Elena had only sharpened it. You cannot tell what a company is really like from the balance sheet. The balance sheet tells you what happened. It does not tell you why. A company can have decent revenue and clean books and still be rotting quietly in the middle, floor by floor, one worn-down employee at a time. And if that rot was what had been killing Meridian, no consultant's report was going to show it to him. He'd have to feel it himself. So he made a decision that Ellen argued against for a full week. Before he installed a single new executive, before he changed one line of policy, he would spend a month working on the floor as an ordinary employee. No title, no special access, just a temp badge and a desk, watching how the place actually treated the people who kept it running. He showed up on a Monday in a plain gray shirt and shoes that were clean but not expensive. He introduced himself to the HR onboarding coordinator as Nathan Reyes, a temporary operations associate brought in to help with a backlog. The coordinator, a tired man named Phil, handed him a badge without looking up, pointed him toward the fourth floor, and went back to his coffee. Nobody looked twice. That was exactly what Nathan wanted. The fourth floor at Meridian was where the real work of the company happened, even though almost no one upstairs seemed to know it. It held the accounts team, the routing coordinators, the billing analysts, and the small group of people who reconciled what the warehouses said they'd shipped against what the clients said they'd received. It was unglamorous, detail-heavy, thankless work. If something was quietly wrong with how the company treated its people, this was the floor where it would show first. His supervisor was Grant Mercer, the operations director. Grant was somewhere in his early 50s, silver at the temples, and he had a way of moving through the floor that told you everything. He never hurried. He never raised his voice above a certain smooth register, and he never had to, because everyone had already learned to lean toward it. He wore his authority the way some men wear an expensive watch they didn't earn, comfortable that no one was going to check the receipt. On Nathan's first morning, Grant looked him over for about 2 seconds, decided he was nobody, and handed him a stack of client reconciliation files that were already 4 days late. These should have been done last week, Grant said, as though Nathan were somehow responsible for a week he hadn't been there for. Then he walked away. Nathan sat down and got to work. The files were a disaster. Mismatched formats, missing reference numbers, 3 different date conventions in the same spreadsheet. It wasn't hard, it was just tedious, the kind of work that eats a day and earns no applause. He put his head down and did it, and while he worked, he watched. By the end of the first week, he understood the map of the floor. There was an inner circle, and there was everyone else, and the line between them was not subtle. Grant sat at the center. Closest to him were Todd Vance and Renee Coleman. Todd was loud. He had opinions about everything, and a talent for saying cruel things in a tone that let him claim he was joking if anyone flinched. Renee was the opposite, quiet and watchful, the kind of person who never said a word more than she needed to, and always said it to the person with the most power in the room. Together, the 3 of them ran the floor like a small country with its own laws, and the first law was simple. Credit flowed up, and blame flowed down. Nathan learned this by watching it happen to himself. In his first week, he finished 3 separate assignments that had been split among 4 people. He didn't announce it. He just cleaned up the files, dropped them in the shared drive, and moved on. 2 days later, he overheard Todd in Grant's glass office, describing the reconciled billing report Nathan had spent 11 hours rebuilding, and taking full credit for it without so much as a pause. Grant nodded, pleased, and forwarded a note upstairs praising Todd's initiative. Nathan's name appeared nowhere in it. Nathan read that email, closed his laptop, and went to get coffee. He wasn't angry. He was taking notes. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern set like concrete. Anything Nathan did that turned out well got attached to someone else's name, usually Todd's, sometimes Renee's, sometimes Grant's directly. Anything that went wrong anywhere on the floor, a late file, a routing error, a client who called in a temper, somehow found its way to Nathan's desk, whether he'd touched it or not. There was a system to it, and the system was old. Mistakes needed a name before they reached Grant, and the name attached was always someone with the least standing to argue. Right now, that was the new temp. Nathan understood this, and he chose to stay in that spot, because the longer he stayed there, the more he saw. Some of it was harder to sit through than the rest. There was a woman on the floor named Carla Mendez. She was in her 30s, a billing analyst, 6 years at the company, and, Nathan learned over cheap break-room coffee, a single mother of 2. Carla was good at her job, better than Todd, better than most of them. But she left at exactly 4:40 most days to make daycare pickup before the late fee kicked in. and Grant had decided long ago to make her pay for that in small, steady humiliations. One Wednesday afternoon, Carla caught a minor error in a shipping manifest, a transposed pallet count, the kind of thing anyone could fix in 2 minutes. Grant chose to fix it in front of the whole floor instead. He stood at her desk and walked through it slowly, loudly, in the patient voice you'd use with a child, making sure every head in the room came up. When he finished, he added, just loud enough, that maybe if certain people weren't so focused on running out the door every afternoon, they'd catch these things themselves. Carla said, "You're right. I'll double-check going forward." Flat, controlled. She kept her eyes on her screen. And when Grant walked away, she sat completely still for a long moment, not moving, not typing, just breathing, and Nathan watched her do it. What struck him wasn't the correction. It was how practiced her stillness was. She had clearly learned over years that any reaction at all would be filed away and used later. He thought about Lucy. He thought about the pickup line at 3:15 and what it would do to him to be shamed in front of a room for the crime of loving his kid enough to be there on time. Then he filed the moment away with everything else, and he kept his face empty. The cruelty on the 4th floor was rarely loud. Mostly it was small. Lunch plans made just within earshot and then quietly closed off before Nathan could ask to come. Questions aimed at him in meetings that weren't really questions, just little traps set in public so that any stumble became evidence. Requests that landed at 4:50 in the afternoon for things due first thing the next morning, always with just enough missing detail to guarantee a mistake, and just enough ambiguity to pin that mistake on him. None of it on its own would have justified a complaint. That was the sophistication of it. Every single incident could be explained away as normal office friction. Only when you laid 3 weeks of them side by side did the shape come clear, and the shape was deliberate. Nathan ran most mornings before dawn, 5 miles through the quiet streets near his house while Lucy slept and the sitter dozed on the couch. He'd always used the early hours to think. On those runs, he turned the 4th floor over in his mind and admitted to himself that he'd expected to find ordinary problems, the usual mix of laziness and ego you get anywhere. What he'd found instead was a small machine, well-built and well-oiled, designed to extract work from people while giving them nothing back, and to break anyone who objected. It had a hierarchy. It had rules. Everyone on the floor knew both, and everyone had made their peace because silence was the only kind of safety the place offered. His father-in-law had said something to him once at Elena's funeral that Nathan had never forgotten. The old man had taken his hand and said the measure of a person isn't how they treat the people who can help them. It's how they treat the people who can't do a thing for them. Nathan had spent 3 weeks on a floor run by people who failed that test every single day, cheerfully, without a flicker of shame. And he had come to understand something he hadn't let himself think clearly until then. He didn't just own this company on paper, he was responsible for it. For Carla, for the coordinator 2 desks over who flinched every time Grant walked by. For all of them. In his 3rd week, Grant gave Nathan real responsibility for the first time, and Nathan would come to understand later exactly why. A major client, one of Meridian's 3 biggest accounts, had flagged a discrepancy in a large multi-warehouse shipment. Somewhere between the docks and the invoices, the numbers had stopped matching, and the client wanted an explanation with documentation. Grant handed the whole reconciliation to Nathan, alone, and told him to build a clean audit trail from source. It was more than he'd been trusted with before, and Nathan took it seriously. He built the tracking file from scratch, coordinated with 2 warehouse managers, and had a solid framework ready 2 days early. Because it was a shared project, he gave Todd and Renee access to the working file so the team could keep building on it while he finished the last sections. It was the reasonable thing to do. It was, in fact, standard practice. He would learn very soon how it was used. On Thursday morning, Nathan came in to find the blinds drawn in Grant's glass office, which never happened. Grant was inside. So were Todd and Renee, and a woman Nathan recognized as Diane Foss from HR, sitting with a folder open in front of her. Nathan had barely set down his bag when Diane came out and asked him to step in. Her expression was the careful blankness of someone reading a script she hadn't written. Grant stood off to one side with his arms folded. Todd sat in the corner with the specific stillness of a man who already knows how the scene ends because he wrote it. Diane told him in a level HR voice that a serious problem had been found in the client reconciliation file. Records had been altered. Shipment figures had been changed to cover a discrepancy rather than report it, which had turned a routine correction into what looked like deliberate falsification of client-facing financials. The changes, she said, traced to Nathan's login. There was a clear activity log. Given the size of the account and the nature of what had been done, the company had no choice but to end his employment, effective immediately. Nathan asked to see the log. Diane glanced at Grant. Grant said the documentation had already gone to legal for review and wasn't available to Nathan right now. Nathan asked whether there was a process to contest it. Diane said that given the seriousness, the decision was final. She slid a single sheet across the desk and asked him to sign it, acknowledging that he'd received the termination notice. Nathan looked at it for a moment. Then he signed. He asked for a copy. Diane gave him one. He thanked her, and he meant it, because whatever this was, it wasn't Diane's doing. He did not look at Grant. He did not look at Todd. He walked back to his desk, and there was already an empty box waiting beside his chair, which told him everything about how long this had been planned. He put in the mug Lucy had painted, the charger, the folder. The floor had gone quiet in that way rooms do when everyone is watching and pretending not to. He picked up the box, carried it to the elevator, wrote it down, and walked out through the front doors into the cold. He set the box on the granite wall, took out his phone, and made the call. "Ellen, it's me." A pause while she said something. "Put the legal hold on everything, 4 years back, every file on the 4th floor. Get the board on a call within the hour." Another pause. Then quietly, "And fire every one of them." The call to Ellen Park lasted 4 minutes. Nathan sat in his car in the parking garage under the building with the engine off and the box on the passenger seat, and he waited for the anger to come, and it didn't. That surprised some people later when they heard the story. It wouldn't have surprised anyone who knew him. Anger needs surprise, and Nathan hadn't been surprised by a single thing that happened in that office. He'd watched it build for 3 weeks. What he felt instead was closer to clarity. The specific stillness that arrives when a problem you've been circling finally shows you its whole shape, and you understand exactly what it's going to take. Ellen was already moving. She'd half expected something like this, and the legal hold went out within 20 minutes, freezing every email, access log, and personnel file connected to the 4th floor going back 4 years. She reached the board chair, a retired shipping executive named Walter Osei, who had stayed on through the transition, and Walter, who was one of maybe 4 people alive who knew who Nathan actually was, cleared his afternoon. Nathan drove home. He changed his shirt. He looked in on Lucy's room out of habit even though she was at school, straightened her stuffed rabbit on the pillow, and then he drove back. This time he didn't use the front doors. He took the private elevator from the executive parking level, keyed in the access code Ellen had given him weeks ago and he'd never once used, and rode it to the top floor, where the boardroom looked out over the whole harbor, and the 4th floor was just a number on a directory. Walter Osei was already there, and so was Ellen, and so was Meridian's general counsel, a sharp, unshowy woman named Priya Nair, who had spent 2 hours pulling records and looked like someone who'd found exactly what she expected to find. Diane Foss from HR had been summoned too, and she sat at the far end of the table with the careful composure of a person who understood that the ground under her had shifted since morning and was still trying to work out how far. They didn't waste time on pleasantries. Walter confirmed the hold was in place and that IT security was already running a parallel trace on the access logs. Nobody on the fourth floor had been told anything. As far as Grant Mercer knew, the temp was gone, the account was covered, and the day was proceeding exactly as planned. Nathan stood at the head of the table and walked them through 3 weeks without notes. The stolen credit, the manufactured blame, Carla Mendez and the pallet count and the way she'd learned to sit still, the 450 deadlines, the billing report Todd had taken word for word, and then the file and the login and the neat little trap he'd walked into that morning. Diane listened to all of it without expression, but Nathan watched her hand tighten on the folder in front of her. She had been handed a document that morning and told to deliver it, and she had not been allowed to see what it was built on. That much was clear. Priya's trace came back before Nathan finished talking. The alterations flagged as his had been made under his login, yes, but not from any machine he had ever used. The originating device was a workstation 2 desks from his, registered to Todd Vance. Someone had used Nathan's credentials from Todd's terminal to change the file, and then pointed at the log as proof. It wasn't sophisticated. It had worked for one reason only. No one had ever bothered to look closely, because no one who could look had ever had a reason to. Priya set the preliminary finding on the table and said plainly that the framing was not ambiguous. Her team would need the rest of the day to assemble the full picture, but what they already had was more than enough to act on. Walter looked at Nathan and asked how he wanted to handle it. Nathan said he wanted to hold an all-hands meeting that afternoon. He wanted the findings presented cleanly, and he did not want anyone told who he was until he stood up in that room and told them himself. The all-hands went out at 2 o'clock, company-wide, through the internal system. Mandatory. Every floor, every team, the ground floor commons at 4. The message was 4 sentences long. There would be an announcement regarding the future ownership and leadership of Meridian Dynamics. Attendance was required. Nothing else. For 2 hours the building buzzed. On the 4th floor, Grant held court by the windows in that low, confident voice, telling anyone near him that transitions like this were opportunities, that companies rewarded people who'd shown they could deliver, that it never hurt to be visible when new leadership was watching. Todd laughed at whatever Grant said. Renee refreshed her inbox. Not one of them connected the meeting to the temp they'd walked out that morning, and not one of them noticed that Diane Foss had never come back to her desk. The commons filled early. By 10 to 4, there were 300 people standing under the high glass ceiling, warehouse staff who'd driven in from the docks mixed with analysts and coordinators, and the finance team from the 5th floor. Walter Ossie stepped up onto the low platform at 4 exactly, and the room settled. He kept it short. He said the founding family had sold their controlling interest some months ago, that the sale had been kept quiet on purpose, and that the new owner had made an unusual request as a condition of taking the company. He had asked to spend his first month at Meridian not as an owner, but as an ordinary employee on the floor doing the work, so that he would understand the company from the inside before he changed a thing about it. Walter said that owner had been in the building for the last 3 weeks. Then he asked Nathan to come up. Nathan walked onto the platform in the same gray shirt he'd been fired in that morning, the same plain shoes, carrying nothing. He stood next to Walter and looked out at the room, and the silence that came over it was total. The particular silence of several hundred people processing something that didn't fit any box they'd walked in with. Near the middle of the crowd, Grant Mercer's face moved through a fast sequence of expressions. Recognition first, then calculation, then something that didn't have a clean name. Todd went pale beside him. Renee had already stopped looking at the stage and started looking at the exits. Nathan watched it happen and felt nothing he'd expected to feel. He hadn't come up there to enjoy it. He'd come up to start. He didn't give a speech. He introduced himself. His name, his background, why he'd bought the company, and why he'd spent 3 weeks pretending to be a temp on the 4th floor. He said it had been the most useful 3 weeks of his working life, and that some of what he'd learned needed to be dealt with today in front of everyone, because he thought the people who'd lived it deserved to hear it from him and not from a memo. Then he stepped aside and asked Priya Nair to take the floor. Priya was precise in the way lawyers become when they are completely sure of their footing. She said that in connection with a personnel matter that had occurred that morning, the legal department had begun reviewing 4 years of records from the 4th floor operations team. That review, she said, had already established that a client reconciliation file had been deliberately altered and then falsely attributed to an employee in order to terminate that employee for something he had not done. She said further examination was surfacing a broader pattern of conduct that the company considered extremely serious, that the full review would be complete within 24 hours, and that the individuals involved had been placed on immediate administrative suspension pending its outcome. She named no one from the stage. Those conversations would happen privately. The room did not erupt. It went very still, the way rooms do when what's being said is heavy enough that people stop performing their reactions and simply take it in. Somewhere near the front, Nathan saw Carla Mendez standing very straight with her hand pressed flat against her chest, and he made himself look away before she saw him looking, because that was hers, not his. He was at a borrowed desk on the top floor at 6 the next morning. The harbor was still gray. Priya arrived at 10 past. With the completed audit in a bound folder and a copy on a secure drive, set both down and took the chair across from him. They worked through it together for 2 hours. The full picture was worse than what Nathan had seen with his own eyes, and he'd seen a lot. Over 4 years, the group around Grant Mercer had held down at least 14 employees through manipulated performance reviews. 4 of those people had raised concerns through internal channels. In every case, the complaint had been routed by design or by the plain failure of a broken reporting structure right back to Grant's level, where it was quietly logged as resolved and never actually looked into. One employee had received a sudden, poorly supported negative review 2 weeks after complaining and had left. Another had been moved to a different floor after what the file described only as a conversation. A third had taken a small settlement and signed something and disappeared from the record. Diane Foss's name appeared as the HR contact on 2 of those 4 files, a detail Nathan noted and set aside for its own conversation. The credit theft was systematic. Project attribution had been rerouted through the team's internal reporting in ways that were consistent and deliberate, and once you knew to look, easy to trace. Todd Vance's name showed up in more than 25 favorable summaries that bore no relationship to what he'd actually done. Renee Coleman had run the paperwork side of it, filing things in ways that made the misattribution nearly impossible to catch without exactly the kind of full review that had never once been done. Grant sat above all of it. His fingerprints weren't always on the surface, but they were in the structure of the thing. And there was Carla. Her file was its own quiet tragedy. 3 years of solid work scored down to mediocre. 2 promotions she'd been the obvious candidate for, given to Todd and to someone who'd since left. A documented note, in Grant's own words, questioning her commitment because of her schedule, a schedule that existed because she was raising 2 kids alone. Nathan read that note twice, then closed the folder and looked out the window for a while. He asked Priya what the legal exposure looked like if the company chose to handle all this quietly. She said it was significant and growing. The employee who'd settled could reopen things if it came out that the company had evidence of a pattern and buried it. The 2 who'd left after complaining were in the same category. Nathan said that wasn't the direction he was considering. Priya said she understood. The decision he'd been turning over since the night before wasn't whether to act. That was settled. The question was how far it reached. Firing Grant, Todd, and Renee was simple. The evidence was specific, and it was theirs. But the audit had also flagged 3 other people on the floor who'd taken part at lower levels, some by actively helping, some by a silence that had protected the machine instead of slowing it. Nathan had read each of their files past midnight, and 2 of the 3 had themselves been targets of Grant's team in earlier years, before deciding, at some point, that it was easier to join the thing than to keep bleeding under it. That history didn't erase what they'd done, but it complicated the question of what fairness looked like in an environment that had been built on purpose to make decency expensive. He decided the 2 who'd once been victims would keep their jobs on a documented final warning basis, with a direct line to the new reporting channel and a plain explanation of why. The 3rd, who had no such history and had simply enjoyed the power, would go with the ringleaders. Then there was Diane Foss. Her role was on the record, but the audit couldn't fully resolve whether she'd actively suppressed those complaints or simply failed to push them up a chain that was designed to swallow them. Nathan decided she'd stay, for now, under a formal review whose outcome would decide her future. It was a harder line to draw than the others. Acting on incomplete evidence in either direction, clearing her or firing her, would set a bad precedent for how decisions got made under him. He'd rather be slow and right. He called Priya back in and told her the terminations would cover Grant Mercer, Todd Vance, Renee Coleman, and the 1 additional coordinator. Each notice would name the specific conduct that led to it, not some generic separation language. The 2 former employees who'd left after complaining would be contacted within the week, and the company would make them whole. The 1 who'd settled would be contacted too, carefully, with no rush. The goal, he said, was to make it right, not to make it fast. By 9, the building had filled, and Nathan rode the elevator down to the 4th floor for the first time since he'd been walked off it. He didn't announce the visit. He stepped off and stood for a moment near the entrance, looking at the space, the rows of desks, Grant's glass office with its blinds, the bank of windows where Grant had stood the day before, explaining to everyone how the future was arranged in his favor. 3 desks were empty and would stay that way. The rest of the floor was at half capacity, people at their chairs but not working, not really. Waiting. Nathan walked to the middle of the floor and asked if everyone could gather. It took less than a minute. They arranged themselves in a loose half-circle, some standing, some pulling their chairs around, all of them watching him with the careful attention of people who'd learned that expressions cost money. He didn't stand behind anything. No podium, no desk between him and them. He spoke at a normal volume, which was enough. He said he wanted to be direct about what had happened and what came next. The audit was done. The decisions were made, and they were final. He wasn't there to explain himself or ask their approval. He was there because these people had worked inside a particular machine for a long time, and some of them had been hurt by it, and he thought they deserved to hear from him in person instead of through a company-wide email. He told them the performance review system on the floor was suspended, effective immediately, and that every review from the last 4 years would be re-examined by an independent HR team before it got used for anything, for anyone. He said that within the week there'd be a real reporting channel, one that would not pass through any manager on its way up, that would go straight to legal and to him. Then he asked if anyone had questions. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Carla Mendez raised her hand. She asked in a steady voice that cost her something to keep steady whether the review of the records would change decisions that had already been made, promotions people had been passed over for, roles they'd been told they weren't ready for. Nathan said yes. He said that was exactly what the review was for, to find the places where the record had been bent and to straighten them out. Carla nodded once and lowered her hand and didn't say anything else, but something in her shoulders let go. Some weight she'd been holding so long she'd probably forgotten it was a choice to hold it. Nathan saw it. He didn't comment on it. He just saw it. A man near the back, a routing coordinator who'd been on the floor almost 4 years, raised his hand and asked carefully whether people who'd stayed quiet would be punished for staying quiet. It was a fair question, and Nathan answered it straight. He said the review was about documented participation in the misconduct, not about silence. He said he understood that keeping your head down in that place hadn't been a neutral choice, it had been survival, and he wasn't interested in punishing people for doing the math on what speaking up would cost them when the system gave them no safe way to do it. What he was interested in, he said, was making sure nobody on this floor ever had to do that math again. The coordinator nodded and lowered his hand. A few people around him let out a breath they'd apparently been holding for a while. Nathan spent the rest of that morning walking the building floor by floor, unannounced. He'd show up, ask people to gather, and have the same conversation. What had happened? What was being done? What would be different, and what they could expect from him? Some floors were guarded. Some people asked hard questions. Most just listened. A few looked at him with the flat skepticism of people who'd heard leadership make promises before and weren't about to adjust their expectations for a stranger in a gray shirt. He didn't ask them to trust him. He told them what he was doing and let that stand on its own. In the afternoon, Grant called the main legal line and asked to speak to Nathan directly. Priya related and asked how he wanted to handle it. Nathan said to put him through. The call lasted 9 minutes. Grant didn't open with an apology. He opened with context. The pressure he'd been under. The impossible targets from above. The competitive culture he'd inherited, as though the culture were weather and not something he had personally built and maintained for years. Nathan let him finish. When he was done, Nathan said he'd read the entire audit, including the parts that predated the setup that morning, and that what it documented wasn't the product of pressure from above. It was a choice, made over and over across 4 years, that had cost real people real careers, and in a couple of cases, real income. He said the decision stood. Grant said he'd given the company 11 years. Nathan said he understood and that the severance would match his contract and the company's obligations, and he thanked him for the call, and he ended it. Todd didn't call. Renee sent a message through a personal lawyer arguing that her role had been administrative, not directive. Priya's team wrote back with the relevant sections of the audit attached, and that was the end of that. By the end of the week, the independent HR review had started. Nathan had a direct reporting line running that skipped the old middle management layer entirely, while new team leads got identified and vetted. And he'd quietly begun putting right the things that could be put right. The first one he handled himself. He asked Carla Mendez to come up to a small conference room on the 5th floor, and when she came in looking wary, braced for bad news out of pure habit, he told her the review had confirmed what he'd suspected, that 2 promotions she'd earned had gone to other people for reasons that had nothing to do with her work. He offered her a team lead role, a real one, with the raise that should have come 3 years ago, and he told her that the position came with the schedule she already kept, because leaving at 4:40 to pick up your kids was not a performance problem, and never had been, and any manager who told her otherwise had been wrong. Carla was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked in a careful voice whether this was real. Nathan said it was. She said okay, and then she said thank you, and then she looked out the window for a while so she wouldn't have to look at him, and Nathan understood that completely, because he'd spent 3 years doing the same thing in kitchens and parking lots and school pickup lines. He gave her the room. He said, take whatever time she needed and come find him when she was ready, and he'd left her there with the harbor and the morning light. The box he'd carried out the front doors was still in the back seat of his car 3 days later. He kept forgetting it was there. One evening, after the building had emptied and the only light left on the top floor was the lamp on his desk, he went down to the garage and brought it up. He set it on the corner of the desk and opened it. The mug Lucy had painted, lopsided and bright. A stick figure family on one side with 3 figures and a dog they'd never owned. The charger, the one thin folder. Small things. Nothing worth keeping, really, except that he'd carried them. Out of a room built to make him feel like he didn't belong anywhere near it, and there was something worth remembering in that. He put the mug on the windowsill where he'd see it. He plugged the charger in. He kept the folder in the drawer. That weekend he had Lucy, and on Saturday morning she asked him, over pancakes, whether he liked his new job. He thought about it. He said he wasn't sure it counted as a job yet, more like a mess he'd agreed to clean up. Lucy considered this with the seriousness of a 9-year-old and asked if the people who made the mess were in trouble now. Nathan said some of them were. She asked if that made him happy. He thought about that one longer. He said it didn't make him happy exactly. He said what made him happy was that a woman named Carla wasn't going to get yelled at anymore for leaving on time to pick up her own kids, the way Carla's boss used to yell at her. Lucy frowned and said that sounded like a mean boss. Nathan said it was. Then he said the thing he'd been circling for weeks without quite putting words to it. He said that anybody can look tough for 1 minute, on a bad day, when they're angry. That's the easy part, and it doesn't mean much. What actually matters, what people remember you for, is what you do after that minute is over. Who you protect, who you make whole, what kind of place you leave behind for the people who'll still be there long after everybody's forgotten the names on the paperwork. Lucy didn't fully follow it. She was 9, and the pancakes were getting cold. But she nodded like she did, the way kids do, and went back to eating, and Nathan sat there in his kitchen with his daughter and understood that the phone call from the granite wall, the one everyone at Meridian would talk about for years, the one that had emptied the 4th floor in a single afternoon, was actually the least important thing he'd done all week. The call was just the door slamming. The real work was everything on the other side of it. Rebuilding the reviews, finding the people who'd left and making it right, sitting across a table from Carla Mendez and watching a weight come off a person who'd carried it so long she'd stopped believing it could ever be set down. That was the part no one would make a video about, but it was the only part that had ever actually mattered. He thought about his father-in-law's hand on his at the funeral. The measure of a person is how they treat the people who can't do a thing for them. He'd spent 3 weeks being one of those people, invisible, disposable, blamed for things he hadn't done, and he'd carried a box out a front door while a room full of people laughed. Then he'd made one call, and the whole rotten machine had come down. But he didn't want to be remembered for the call. He wanted to be remembered for the floor. For the day, it stopped being a place where good people learned to sit very still and started being a place where a single mom could leave at 4:40 with her head up and nobody said a word. The work had barely started. He knew that. But it had started, honestly. And in his experience, that was the only foundation that had ever held anything worth building.